The short, sharp ringing of a siren is carried along the corridors. The steel door of a cell opens, and from within, they lead out a prisoner bound in handcuffs. Straight away, they chain him to his escort's arm, a strong SWAT officer, and lead him to the exit. He's spent 10 years in prison, but there's no sense of regret or fear on the man's face. He smiles, looking around the narrow corridors. No, he's not being walked to freedom. He'll never be freed. The letters PZ on his prison uniform show that, signifying that the prisoner is serving 2 life sentences. Currently, they're escorting him to Irkutsk, to a crime scene, so that the man can give evidence for the murders he's committed. And it's a truly shocking and horrifying event because it's the 85th time he's doing it. The Russian serial killer Mikhail Popkov has surpassed the infamous Andrei Chikatilo and has twice the numbers of victims. The Angarsk maniac is considered one of Russia's cruelest serial killers. He's one of the few to be serving 2 life sentences. In 2020, after 5 years living in a detention center with a strict regime, he decided to speak out about new victims. But he didn't do it out of remorse. With a smile, the maniac says that he simply wanted to escape the confines of his cell for a time and have some fun. Going off confirmed sources alone, more than 80 women have died by his hand, and this figure might still be higher. When speaking about his victims, Mikhail shows no remorse whatsoever. He doesn't consider himself a maniac at all, rather a noble avenger who purified the world of fallen women. The Angarsk maniac acted in the Irkutsk Oblast and in the neighboring territories from 1992. They only managed to deduce who he was in 2012. Even now, Popkov's case isn't closed. The killer gives out snippets of information and has no intent of immediately speaking about all of his victims. Twice sentenced to life imprisonment, it's as if Mikhail is toying with his investigators, gaining pleasure from the process. But what made this person a monster? Who was Mikhail Popkov before he turned into the Angarsk maniac? In the 90s, Russia went through some extremely rough times. The powers had changed and laws alongside them. Total impunity and a peak of gangster activity overwhelmed the huge country, which had been thrown to the arbitrary will of fate. In certain regions, life was particularly tough and dangerous. The Irkutsk Oblast, where the town of Angarsk is located, was one such region. In order to feed your family in those difficult times, when everywhere there was devastation and unemployment, people had to work their fingers to the bone. The junior lieutenant police officer, Mikhail Popkov, also lived according to that principle. In the evening, after his shift, he worked as a taxi driver to earn more money for his wife and beloved daughter. Mikhail was a true gearhead. Generally speaking, he agreed to any additional income, be it digging graves or unloading vehicles on a construction site. Mikhail, therefore, was considered quite a well-off person by Russian standards of the time. The young and charming man quickly found common ground with people. Working in a taxi, he spoke with passengers a lot, always learning something new. But in this work, there was also something that gave him no peace: women. Many representatives of the fairer sex at that time were ready to be intimate with the man simply because of his eloquence. Their compliance evoked disgust in the young police officer. And in 1992, this disgust grew into icy hatred. Late one evening, Mikhail returned home from his shift and discovered clear signs of adultery. Literally several hours before his return, his wife had slept with another man. Mikhail didn't divorce his wife only for the sake of his beloved daughter. He wanted his daughter to grow up in a stable household. However, the betrayal of his wife changed his life forever. In the ill-fated year of 1992, working as a taxi driver for the umpteenth time, Mikhail drove a young woman home. Unexpectedly, he offered to postpone taking her home and let her kick back with him in a romantic setting. The woman agreed. According to Mikhail's former lover, this man created the impression of a noble knight in hard times. Against a background of mostly drunk and unemployed men, Mikhail stood out for his wealth, tidiness, good manners, and strong, tight body. But his main weapons were his charm and wit. Mikhail could easily woo a woman during a casual conversation. That evening, Mikhail bought some expensive wine and snacks and took his fellow traveler somewhere countryside. There, as was promised, Mikhail created a romantic setting and quickly convinced the woman to become more intimate with him. But after this, hatred for his female companion boiled up inside him because she had surrendered herself to the first person she'd met. A fierce argument broke out, and Mikhail killed for the first time. The victim resisted for a long time, and Popkov had to go to some effort to kill her. He didn't even try to hide the body. He just returned home. The next few days he was extremely agitated, experiencing animalistic fear. But he wasn't afraid of what he'd done. He was afraid he would get caught. The Angarsk maniac has now said that he experienced this fear after every murder. At that time, he'd never committed a full-blown criminal act. And Mikhail knew that he could lead his hunt unpunished. But very few of the women who took his taxi were killed. The majority escaped death because Popkov himself let them go. The Angarsk maniac had a strong principle, which he broke only a few times. If a woman didn't agree to get to know him more closely, then he simply drove her home and even helped her carry her things in. The Angarsk maniac selected only those women who showed the initiative themselves. In this story, the police's inaction is just as shocking as the acts of the Angarsk maniac are shocking. The number of dead women steadily grew, but no one noticed the connection between the crimes, and there was no question of it being a serial killer. Part of the investigation's scope was reduced. Some victims remained missing persons for many years. The unprofessionalism of the police gave Mikhail Popkov the freedom to act. But the Angarsk maniac's case received a development all the same after an article about murdered women was published in the national newspaper in 1999. The situation interested Russia's Attorney General, and Valery Koskarev, a senior investigator, was sent to the Irkutsk Oblast. When he saw the criminal acts committed against dead women, he flew into a rage. Certain cases had been summarized in all of 3 pages, and evidence had been lost. He gathered all the similar cases and looked through them in detail. There could be no doubt, this was definitely a serial maniac who had muddled the clues wonderfully. The modus operandi were identical. The maniac had driven the victim out of town. They drank wine together, had sex, and then came the murder with a blow to the head. But otherwise, the murder weapon was always different, and even the murderer's signature itself varied. The first victims' bodies were left right where the crime took place. On the deceased, they discovered clear signs of a fight and multiple wounds, the majority of which were non-fatal. The last victims were murdered in the same manner, but already more artfully. All their bodies were hidden, and some of them the police never found until the psychopath spoke out. Kosterov was certain that it was the same person at work here, and soon police workers fell under suspicion as well. The man who they had to catch was clearly well-built and strong. The wounds inflicted upon the victims told them this. Using a screwdriver, he had struck one woman in the temple with such force that before the autopsy, it had been considered a bullet wound. The murderer also traveled in a Lada Niva, which was often distributed to police workers. And the last decisive argument was him not being noticed on the roads. The murderer's car was never stopped for police inspection. That meant it was one of their own. Absolute proof came in 2012 when they found traces of the maniac's DNA on a victim he'd earlier raped. Based on preliminary data, the Angarsk maniac had to be a well-built police worker with blood type B. There were 354 such people. All of them were invited to take a DNA test. Mikhail Popkov also showed up on that list and went to get tested, although he hadn't worked in the police since 1999. The man, as always, was well put together, cheery and self-confident. No one suspected him of anything. In addition, none of his colleagues and acquaintances knew what Popkov did right after his biomaterial was sent in for testing. He immediately got in his car and rushed off to a lawyer, telling them he might be falsely accused in the case of the Angarsk maniac. Again, this didn't arouse any suspicion. Prior to that moment, they'd already tried to accuse many people of the murders that were on everyone's lips. They'd even seriously beat up one suspect, trying to force him to give evidence that he couldn't supply. The next day, Popkov's family left town. Mikhail, a model family man, told everyone that he was going off on holiday. And when the results of the test confirmed the maniac's identity, Popkov was already out of their reach. They announced their search for Russia's most bloody psychopath. He didn't manage to hide for very long. Mikhail Popkov was arrested the same year in Vladivostok in 2012, where he'd intended either to buy his next vehicle for the next part of his journey and then sell it on, or to escape the country. On arresting the Angarsk maniac, they discovered a weapon. Popkov didn't deny his part in the murders, but he didn't confess to everything straight away. According to the investigation, Popkov dragged out time so as to not end up in Russia's strictest prison, the Black Dolphin. However, with time, Popkov confessed to 84 murders, which, as before, he doesn't consider to be crimes. The Angarsk maniac also denies any accusations of raping the women. In his words, almost all of them agreed to intimate relations willingly, and they were murdered for it. 85 times Popkov went off to crime recreations where he precisely demonstrated the murder of each of his victims. He recalled everything in precise detail and never once made an error in his accounts. But the Angarsk maniac claims that he recalls neither the faces nor the names of his victims. The investigative committee, however, believes otherwise. The Angarsk maniac, even while imprisoned for life, still plays the game that's known only to him. Investigators are confident that his last murder was committed not in 2008, but much later. Having studied his behavior, it can be said with certainty that Popkov was unable to stop. Popkov was also declared completely sane and was given a single diagnosis: a tendency to kill people. The Angarsk maniac talks to journalists and investigators with a smile, believing that he did everything in life right. He responds cryptically to questions about the real number of victims, saying, "I'll remember." Investigators are sure that the Angarsk maniac will still confess to new crimes several more times. But what do you think? Write in the comments below what you think about this person. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel.